there is probably nothing quite as exciting as the prospect of buying a new flute. But it's also quite an overwhelming and confusing process. When is the right time to upgrade? What type of flute should you be looking at? What specs should you be considering? How do you even go about buying a new flute? And specifically, what flute should you buy? I've been asked these questions so many times, so today I am here to help you guys and give you a bit of a guide to buying a new flute. I took this a whole step further though, and I actually created a guide to buying a flute. It's a PDF which goes into quite a lot more depth than this video will. You guys can click on a link down below to get it, or at the end of this video we're going to link you to it as well. Okay, first things first. How do you know when it's the right time to upgrade your instrument? Well, if you're asking that question, chances are it probably is the right time to upgrade already, but I like to think about 3 big reasons why somebody might want to upgrade their instrument. The first one is that you're playing on an instrument that needs repair work, or it needs a bit of an overhaul, but actually overhauling the instrument or repairing the instrument is going to cost more than just buying a new instrument. Now, you might not go for an upgraded instrument per se, like you might still go for a less expensive beginner flute, but chances are that if your instrument is in such a bad condition, it's going to be an upgrade even if it is a cheap beginner flute that you purchase. This is my moment to add a word of warning to those who are tempted to buy those cheap flutes on Amazon and elsewhere. They seem really cheap, they work well for a little while, but they will fall apart eventually, and it is just not going to be worth repairing those things. So you're going to be wasting your money in the long run. Okay, the other big reason why you might want to upgrade is because you have reached the limits of your current instrument. The better the flute is, the more possibilities it has. It creates a more clear, nuanced sound. You can do more dynamics on it, more tone colors on it. The articulation is more responsive. The key work and the mechanism is more responsive. So the better you get, the better the instrument you're going to need to keep up with you. My best description of this is kind of like a set of kitchen knives. Like if you give a chef a set of really bad kitchen knives to use, but they're really good at chopping vegetables in those cool fancy ways that I can't do. But if you can chop like that and you've got a blunt knife, it's going to be incredibly frustrating no matter how skilled you are. That would be an interesting TV show. Giving chefs really bad knives and seeing what they do. The last reason is just as legitimate. Maybe you just want to spoil yourself. And there are a few things that you need to be careful of. I will get into that. But if you just want to spoil yourself because you want to buy a nice instrument and you want to reward yourself for all your hard work, then that's awesome. If you're still unsure as to whether or not you should be upgrading, then my suggestion is try an upgraded instrument. Try an instrument that's a step above the instrument you're currently playing and feel how it feels and listen to the sound. If you feel and hear a difference, then it's time to upgrade. I've had so many students, they're playing on their old instrument for such a long time, they're not sure whether they should upgrade or if they deserve it or are worth it. And then they play on a nice instrument and they're like, oh my word, this is so much easier. So don't be a flute martyr and suffer on a bad instrument. If you can feel the difference with a better instrument, then it's time. Near the end of this video, I am going to give you guys very specific recommendations of instruments that I recommend, so stay tuned for that. But let me first talk you through some of those other questions. Now, there are different types of upgrades that you can do. And generally we distinguish flutes into 3 big categories. We have the beginner flutes category, sometimes also known as student flutes, but beginner flutes. These are flutes that are usually sort of between $500 and $1,500. Then we have our intermediate flutes or our step-up flutes. These are sort of between $1,500 to around $4,000 to $5,000. And then we have our handmade professional flutes, which can go from $5,000 all the way up to $84,000. I'm not joking, that's a real flute. So if you're currently playing a beginner flute, of course your next step would be an intermediate or step up flute. However, there is an argument to be made that you could skip straight to a kind of entry level professional instrument or handmade instrument, but we'll get there. I also just want to mention that sometimes for intermediate flute, the word student flute is also used, which can get really confusing. So I prefer to think about beginner, intermediate, and professional instruments. Now, the higher the level of the instrument, the more options you will have. So for example, beginner flutes generally don't have open holes. Step up or intermediate flutes and professional instruments generally are open holed. There are some specs like the C# trill key and the D# roller that are only really an option for your more kind of handmade instruments. But you can find the odd intermediate instrument with them too. Your intermediate flutes are usually silver plated. Sometimes they have solid silver components as well, whereas your handmade professional instruments are generally going to be sometimes silver plated, sometimes solid silver or gold or platinum, or yeah, the sky's kind of the limit with those. And of course, the more precious the metal, the more expensive the instrument as well. Now, part of your decision around which flute to buy is going to be based on your budget. If you do not have a big budget, then an intermediate step-up flute is a really great, solid option. But if you do have the budget and you want to buy a more forever flute, you might consider skipping that intermediate flute and going straight for a more entry-level professional instrument. There's nothing wrong with that. So you do not necessarily need to follow the order here. The intermediate flutes are a really great budget option though for those of you who are on a budget, because you often get the specs of the much more expensive instruments but at a much better price point. So you can get your beautiful open-holed instrument with your B-foot joint, your lovely hand-cut head joint very often, and honestly this flute will last you a really long time. Okay, but a small word of warning about upgrading too quickly, because you can actually upgrade too fast, where you go for an instrument that is going to be more difficult or too difficult for you to actually play at your current level. Now this is probably going to be fine for, your first $10,000 of flute, if I can put it that way. But when you start getting into the flutes with gold and platinum, you're going to have two big issues. The first big issue is it's going to be a much more resistant instrument, making it a lot more difficult to play, which means you can do it, but you might be a bit frustrated starting out. The other big consideration is weight. When we add all these extra things like the C-sharp trill keys, the B-foot, the gold, the platinum, and the instrument becomes heavier and heavier. And so you want to consider carefully whether or not you want all those little extra bits and bobs, or if you rather just want a lightweight instrument. Maybe it's just a C-foot instrument. Maybe you decide not to go for things like the C-sharp trill keys and the D-sharp rollers and all of that. I will, however, recommend split E mechanism. Don't do without it, especially if you're a less advanced player. Like, yes, there probably are really nice instruments where the split E mechanism isn't that necessary, but I have to be honest with you, with any students I have encountered, I have not found a single one where I haven't immediately identified that either they have played on a split E mechanism flute in the past, or that they are currently playing on one. There is a difference. It is a little bit more expensive. It does add a little bit of extra weight to the flute, but honestly, of all the specs, split E mechanism, it's worth it. It's worth it. You could probably cut everything else out, but split E, I wouldn't. By the way, in our guide, we go into a little bit more detail explaining what these different specs are. So if you are completely confused, then I'm going to advise go and download that guide and check it out. Some of you might ask me, what about inline and offset G? Well, very often with that split E mechanism, you have to have an offset G mechanism, although that's not even so true anymore. This is going to come down to personal preference. Personally, I love the offset G. It's a little bit more comfortable for my hands, especially for people with really small hands. The offset G seems to be the better option. My teacher, though, swore by inline flutes. He said everyone should be playing inline flutes and inline flutes only. So there are, like with everything, many opinions on this. And my advice is go with what you either used to. So if you're currently playing an offset G, carry on playing offset. If you're playing an inline, carry on playing inline. Or if you find a really lovely instrument that is one or the other, know that you will actually adapt and learn. In fact, there is no substitute for good hand position either way. So whether you're inline or offset, you need to make sure that your hand position is good. So my quick recommendations, if you had to ask me, like, what do I recommend in terms of specs? Open holes, yes. Split E, absolutely. Offset G, I'd go for it. B-foot. For less advanced players, I'm going to be honest with you. If weight is a concern, I would leave away the B-foot and honestly go for a C-foot. This might shock some of you, but you may need be like 3 times in your flute playing career. I'm not even joking. And for those 3 times, I promise you, you can do without it. For most of you, I'd recommend a silver flute, either silver plated if you want a slightly lighter instrument, or solid silver. Again, this is probably going to shock some of you, but I probably would not worry about things like C-sharp trill keys and D-sharp rollers and all of that. On some flute, the D-sharp rollers are actually worse than without them. So if you are going to go for that, at least try it out. But certainly things like the C-sharp trill key is just going to add extra weight to the instrument. Now, if you want to buy an instrument that you might want to resell down the line, then absolutely go for all the bells and whistles and make that instrument resellable, especially to a more professional player. But as an amateur player that's just doing it for the love of it, I actually think you can do without a lot of these things. I know sometimes it doesn't make us feel as cool, but I think you're going to get a lot more joy out of the instrument if it's a bit lighter and easier to play. Now, if weight is not an issue, then by all means, go for your B foot, go for your C sharp trill, go for that nice thick tubing, do the works. Absolutely. But it kind of brings me to my most important thing, which is you have to try out these instruments, if possible, before you buy them. Now, if you're living like me in South Africa, it's very, very difficult to try out an instrument, and very often I had to kind of find people living close by or in the country that had similar instruments that I could at least try out and get a feel for. But if you were able to pop into your local flute shop or phone up the Flute Center of New York, they will actually ship flutes to you to try out if you're living in the US, and you can try them and then send back the ones that you don't want to purchase. We even have a little code down below, which not only gives us a commission, which we're super grateful for, but actually will give you an extended trial period and an extended warranty, and I think free shipping or some other really cool stuff. So go and check out that code. Some of you might be asking about secondhand instruments, like, can I buy a nice secondhand flute? And the answer is yes, absolutely, but you've got to be very careful where you buy it from. Very often the condition of secondhand flutes is not very good. And so you get an instrument, but it doesn't work, and you have to put more money to fix it than you actually paid for it in the first place. So if you are going to buy a secondhand instrument, my advice is go to a flute shop that has overhauled and looked at that instrument and can give their stamp of approval to that flute so that you know you're getting an instrument in a good condition. Okay, now for what you guys are probably all here for, which is my list of specific instruments that I recommend you buy. But in the beginner category, the winners are... In the beginner category, we have got 3 recommended brands that I like to recommend. I've got the Yamaha 221, 222 or 212, depending on what country you're in and what's in stock. We've got the Dejao flutes, lovely instruments. I recently did a review on them. 100, 200 or 300 series, those are the beginner instruments they've got. It's going to depend on your budget which of those you're going to go for. And then we've got the Trevor James instruments. We've got the 10X or the 5X, or I think it's the 10XE now and 5XE. In fact, in a video I did a while back where I looked at beginner instruments, it was actually the Trevor James 5X that came out tops. So really nice instruments. For your intermediate flutes, I recommend the Azumi flutes. They're lovely flutes with altus head joints. And in fact, I played on one for many, many, many years. I would recommend here the AZ1 or the AZ2, but the other kid on the block, the Dejao flutes, again coming in 500 and 700 series, are really, really lovely instruments as well, and strong competitors to those Azumi flutes. Yamaha also makes some decent intermediate flutes that you can go look at, 362 and 462. There are of course other brands here that we can recommend, and we have put these brands into our flute guide as well. In terms of professional instruments, now my favorite go-to instrument that I guide my students to are either the Muramatsu flutes or the Miyazawa flutes. I love them. I think they're incredibly reliable instruments, especially the Muramatsu GX and EX. If you want to kind of skip that intermediate flute phase and go straight for a really kind of solid, potentially forever flute, then the Muramatsu GX is a really, 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 really good option. The Miyazawa 402 or 602s are absolutely gorgeous instruments as well, and these 2 instruments have regularly come up as the 2 top instruments when students have been trying out different instruments. That being said, I had a student who tried out a Muramatsu and just didn't sound good on it, and then we played on a Haynes flute. She's used to playing Haynes and she sounded absolutely awesome. So Haynes are right up there as well with any of their Q series instruments. Of course, you could be going for much more pricey instruments as well. Muramatsu, Miyazawa, Haynes all make really top of the line instruments, gold and platinums and all sorts of things. And then there are other flute brands out there like Powell, Sankyo, Burkhardt, Brannan, Altus that are all making fantastic instruments as well. I will say that in terms of the more expensive instruments, I don't think that there are any really bad flute makers out there, but I absolutely recommend that you try before you buy. If you have any other questions or you would like some more help with finding a good flute, pop some comments down below, ask me questions, or of course respond to one of the emails that we send you and ask your questions there. So a little reminder, we're going to be dropping the link to the flute guide for you guys right over there. you can click on that and go and get the flute guide. We just ask that you sign up for our mailing list where we can continue to inject your practice space with motivation and inspiration. Happy practicing, as always. Happy flute shopping. I'm excited for some of you to get beautiful new instruments, and I will see you guys soon.